I said at the beginning of this, my name is Daina Bouquin. I'm the head librarian here at the Center for Astrophysics, and I'm going to talk to you about some work that happened over the summer and kind of into the fall a little bit here. But this is all kind of the follow-on work that's come from my work at the Force 11 Software Citation Implementation Working Group, where we've been thinking a lot more about the challenges of citing software and why citing software is fundamentally more challenging than citing a paper. So in a lot of ways, the relevant information that would go into a citation to software is not obvious, and the norms are not established, so to speak. Some fields do software citation more adeptly and more specifically than others, and so you usually don't have to ask certain things like, what is the title of the paper, or what labels do I use to specify the version of a paper? How do I identify the authors of the paper? You usually don't have to ask that with papers, but you do have to ask all of those things with software. And so in 2016, the precursor working group to the working group that I'm a part of established something called the Software Citation Principles, which I think that you're all somewhat familiar with, and Shelby kind of alluded to them at one point on her slide. But you basically have the idea that software citations need to enable normative legal credit and attribution for authors, and they need to uniquely and persistently identify software itself and enable access to the software and its associated metadata. So this seems pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of things that make this really challenging, because archive software is the most persistent software to cite, and therefore the most citable, but it's still sometimes really challenging to cite archive software. You can have things like the software, there's no field for software version, for instance, or you can have software that's associated with a paper or a data set, and it's not clear that the authors are the same as the authors that are specified in, say, the data set or the primary record. So there are still a lot of challenges to actually implementing software citation, even when we're talking about citing the most persistent and stable software that's out there. And so one of the things that this group that I'm a part of decided that we would work on is kind of bring people together to try just moving the needle on the challenges that are impacting software citation implementation. So there are so many things that need to change about the scholarly communication ecosystem and norms more broadly to see software as the first class scholarly object that it is, that it's kind of unrealistic to say we're going to hold a meeting and we're going to solve all the problems. But we did want to bring people together to look at all of the issues in place and see where we could start making more headway, because for the last few years, practices and I guess efforts in these areas have been somewhat stagnant. And so we wanted to bring people together to figure out why and what we could do next. So we took a two-part approach. So this was during the pandemic. Initially, we had planned to do a large in-person meeting where we'd bring everyone together and do a lot of work in person. But during the pandemic, that wasn't really possible. So we decided to split this up into like a two-part approach. So we had an in-person workshop that was like a small group this summer, but prior to that, we had a series of online focus groups that were much larger. So we had about 50 people basically participate in discussions about how they view problems around software citation, how they prioritize those problems, to try to help identify barriers that are impacting software citation implementation more broadly. And then during the in-person workshop, we were able to take those themes to this smaller group. So all of the themes that emerged from the online focus groups, bring those to the in-person workshop and do some more concrete brainstorming around these issues to try to synthesize some ideas together for what we can do next to just kind of move the needle. And so from the series of focus groups that we held earlier on in the summer, we identified a couple of themes. And so the first one was that most preservation platforms that people who write software have available to them were actually designed for data and publications, not for software. So you have this problem where software is kind of being shoehorned into platforms that are really not there to meet the needs of software authors or to describe software as like the unique object that it is. Awareness about software citation metadata standards is pretty low. It's going to vary from field to field. Some fields are more aware of, say, the CFF file format or code meta, but generally it's not something that is really widely known about. And I say two standards with different strengths here leads to confusion because there are kind of these two metadata formats that can support software citation needs, but because they have sort of different strengths, that does make it so it's a less straightforward message for software authors and for people trying to cite software, what they should do with those files. We also identified that there are very few immediate incentives to encourage software authors to actually generate and then maintain the metadata that would go into a software citation. So most of the time, people are thinking about the long-term impacts of not citing software. So people in the long run not getting credit, software becoming harder to find and access over time. Those are all things that are clearly bad and we want to prevent them, but they're not impacting people immediately. And so that makes it hard to get people to take action. There was a couple more themes that came out of the focus groups. One is that it's not clear when to create separate records for software and its related digital objects. So software is very rarely like a, at least in many fields anyway, an output that is just in its own silo. It's usually associated with a paper, it's associated with specific data sets, it's associated with other software projects. And so when you have these mixed objects in archives, it's not clear when you should separate them out and create separate identifiers for them, or where it's fine to have them together because they would be meaningless apart. So that's like a kind of a question about creating records and maintaining them as networked objects. It's also clear that automatically generated metadata is really messy. So I'm sure many of you know about the connection that exists between GitHub and Zenodo and the challenges of curating automatically generated metadata or incomplete metadata, GitHub handles coming in as author names, not having authorship lists in an order that the authors may like. That's kind of challenging. It's also clear that any tooling that exists out there to help people create software citation metadata or to do things like automatically archive their software can be buggy, and or if you just hit an error or in the way that you execute it just once, that can kind of put a bad taste in someone's mouth and they can just not try it again next time. So that was clearly a detriment. And we also talked a lot about the fact that there's already software in archives and repositories with a lot of missing metadata. So it's not clear what to do about that, that software and how to cite it. So we had these in-depth conversations online, and we brought these themes to this in-person meeting where we broke up this already a relatively small group of 12 people into more groups, so further, so that they could spend time brainstorming about these issues and these themes and come up with these general things that we could do or things that should be focused on so that we can kind of get beyond these challenges. And the first group, so we did a series of structured brainstorming exercises that I don't have time to go into, but in the end, we formed 3 groups, one of which identified the need for there to be a real shared vision for what we're working towards with software citation. So not only do we not really have like a unified vision for what we're aiming for, there's a lot of different competing motivators for why you would want software citation to be more ubiquitous. And some of those motivations kind of compete against each other. For instance, is software citation about the practice of acknowledging the use of software, or is it about a greater standardized way in which software citation can be enabled? So these are all related motivations, but not having like a clear path forward for what it is we're all working towards makes it so we're all kind of potentially, we could be supporting each other's work, and we're not always. So lack of vision. And the next group kind of focused on the idea that although there's always a lot of reasons why making changes is hard, there are some actions we can take now without additional resources being needed. And so this group focused on the idea that we could create a website that could act as a more centralized resource for information on software citation in practice. So right now there's a lot of like theoretical work in software citation. So work that kind of goes into the motivations and how it's done and the challenges and things like that. But if you want just like a really simple answer of how do I do this, that's kind of buried. So it could also be a place where we could share really simple recommendations about software citation formats. And we thought it would be good to write a paper specifically for the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums community on what it means to create a software-ready repository that can enable software citation. And the last group had begun as a group that wanted to focus more on how do we address these mixed data types, these mixed deposits that include software. But in the process of discussing this as an issue, it became really apparent that there is a lack of interdisciplinary guidance on all of these topics. So you have people within the GLAM communities, you have people within different contexts that are at different levels of familiarity with a lot of the issues that are inherent to the problem. And so having there be more guidance that's directed at all these various communities would be helpful for things like software citation metadata, software publishing, FAIR and FAIR for research software principles. That's something that's lacking, and having more of that would help us get to where we want to be. So last minute, so basically we decided that the Force 11 software citation implementation working group is likely going to be the most appropriate convening entity to oversee some future work in these areas, and that for the coming year, some of the priorities should be establishing that shared vision, developing a more cohesive single web presence for resources, and specifically promoting simple guidance on the use of CFF and code meta. So those interdisciplinary resources that I mentioned that from group 3 would be something that be incorporated into this unified website. So yeah, that's where we're at now. I don't know if we've got time for questions. That was like a lot to go over, so thanks for letting me.
It was a really useful summary of the outcomes of that workshop. So that's just what we were looking for. So thanks for that. And we have a little bit of time for questions. Anyone have questions?
I have one. So I would like to thank you and for all this work. I think is super important. I'm still, when I talk to people about this, they always come back to me with the same question, which is, yeah, but I want others to cite my paper or to cite the paper where I have my software. And now we are telling them, yeah, you have the citation for the software, but you have the Synodo record, and then you have maybe the DOE record and the software heritage record, and then you have all these things at the same time. I understand why they are useful, right? But at the same time, there are so many identifiers and different systems that many people still get confused. So do you think that in your point number 1, this unified vision, this will likely get clarified, or this is like ongoing thing?
Well, I think that it's going to be, I mean, this is sort of an opinion at this point. I think that the unified vision will help clarify this to some extent, but I think agreeing on what is the motivator and what is the end goal will go a long way towards helping create more straightforward guidance about how to make decisions about all of these identifiers. I do think too that the motivation that I have with all of this is to, in the end, not necessarily pick like the one identifier to rule them all, but to give disciplinary communities a better sense of what all their options are so that they can kind of establish common practices. Because what we see in the scholarly communication landscape more broadly for the most part, is different domains, different disciplines kind of develop their own norms and practices around how they cite things and what's expected. And I think as long as those communities like land on a practice that meets the software citation principles and can meet this unified vision, I don't think it's necessarily going to matter if they're citing like the software heritage string or if they're going with the Zenodo record. I think as long as it's clear what they should be doing and that practice can become something that's ingrained and simple for them, we'll be there, you know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions? I know that was kind of a dodge, honestly, too, with the question, because it's a hard one.
It is. It's a little. Yes. It's hard. That's why I ask it, because I've been asked that question many times, and I sometimes do not know the correct answer, right?
Well, I think part of it too is just a kind of being an instigator of those conversations too with the community to see like what are their priorities, what are the tools that fit most cleanly into their existing workflows. You know, what is it that they want to do and how do you kind of help them make that normative?
I have a suggestion. Do you want to mention the report and where it will be available?
Sorry. So
no worries, of course.
Yeah, Anna's actually going to be helping lead the final stages of this. We've been working on a report that summarizes everything that I just walked through and gives a lot more detail. And we're hoping to put that out on archive sometime next month. And so hopefully that'll be something that can get circulated more widely to the community.
I'm sure, Anna, you'll share it once it's out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hervé, you've got a question?
Yes, thanks a lot for this presentation. I was wondering whether, so one of the challenges that you're going to meet here is changing the practices of scholarly software developers, and I'm wondering whether you've been considering adding, trying to add to describe this workflow in the context of a software management plan, because I mean, from where I'm working out, it seems like it's more and more used as a way to influence the behavior of researchers who develop software, because funding agencies and institutions more and more tell software developers, well, if you want to create new software tools, then it's fine, but best for everything related to best practices, you should populate a software management plan and sort of follow the directions that it gives you. So yeah.
I think that that's really insightful because we didn't actually talk much about software management plans in the context of this meeting. But I do think that they're relevant. I think they're still emerging though. I don't think that most domains actually, so I think that this is an emerging area where citation should clearly be a part of the conversation. And I think that that could be part of some of the conversation about a shared unified vision for what we're actually aiming for, because something as simple as citation should be part of conversations about software management plans. I think it is valid, but it wasn't really something that we talked about in this setting.
Yeah, I'm just saying this because I can remember that even 5 years ago, discussing data management plans was still of a bit of an edge topic, but nowadays they're basically everywhere in research, and every new research projects has to first create a data management plan and have a data manager. So I was wondering, maybe this is going to be what happens with software within a few years, with this concept maturing.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if this became, in the same way that FAIR for research software principles have been established. I think that this is kind of a next step.
Absolutely. Thanks.
We are slightly over time, but I'll let Peter ask the last question.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Daina. So my question was based on a talk that I heard by Dan Foreman-Mackey at the AAS last week, where he talked about open source software. And this is actually something I've spoken to Alice about as well, and that is the genealogy of codes. When you have a code, how does that fit in? Have you ever thought about that? The use case I'm thinking of, if you have a code, then it's sometimes and often derived from another code. It's just a better version. Sometimes in astronomy, at least, you have one parent code and there's 4 different versions of them used by 4 different observatories. It's a shameful thing that it happens, but it is true. So how do we take care of that kind of registry item, the genealogy of codes?
I think there's a couple of things you can think of when you think of the genealogy of codes, and one is the dependency networks that exist between different pieces of software. And so repositories have to understand what kind of deposit they're trying to actually enable access to, or so are you trying to enable something that's going to run, or just access to something for its own right so that you can examine the code base. And so I think that different types of curatorial practices are going to guide that kind of question, but what you're talking about here is more different versions of the same software that have kind of become spliced. And I think we do have different kinds of relators that can be used in repositories to actually describe how things are related to each other. So this is a derivative of this. This is the same as this. And this is, again, going to be a metadata maintenance and curation issue. I'm not so sure about how it applies to citation, though. There has been work by Dan Katz and Arfon Smith and others on a principle called transitive credit. So this is a kind of a theoretical practice that could be used to make it so software dependencies are given a quantifiable amount of credit when someone cites software that uses that dependency. So I think that this is something that's kind of way down the line. I haven't actually heard of anyone doing any kind of formal implementation of transitive credit, but I mean, the ideas are out there. I think that we're just kind of some steps away from that. But I think predominantly when I think of the genealogy of code, I'm thinking this is more of curatorial practices and community engagement than a citation issue.
Yeah, I wasn't actually never thinking about this transitional thing. I was more thinking about when you describe software in its completeness, citation is one important thing, but there's all of these other little things. And the other thing is the genealogy. How did the code come to be?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Daina, for the awesome talk, and we look forward to seeing the workshop report.